Similar to the previous tutorial on performing a dry run for migrations, the process of initiating a dry run, or in this tutorial, creating an empty migration, is straightforward. The primary focus here, and probably the more predominant question, is why? What is the significance of, in this tutorial, an empty migration? Creating an empty migration for a specific Django app involves generating a migration file without any changes to the database schema. So you can see in this example here, make migrations. I select the app. We only have one app in this example code base. So inventory, and then we use the empty option. So if we perform that task, we will find that a migration has been created. If we go back into the migrations, take a quick look. This looks like it is the initial migration file because it is the first migration file. If I run the command again, you can see that that one then will just get incremented. I end up with a number 002 and this random set of numbers. The naming scheme isn't necessarily very useful there. So of course, what you can do is go ahead and use the name flag at the end and then name it. In this case, I've just added the name test. You can see that when we create this empty migration, it is named appropriately. Now that saves me a separate tutorial because we now learned how to name the migrations using the name option. So that will work with migrations as well. So you can see that we've run the global migrations command here for, in actual fact, for the individual app. And then we've just used the name option to name the migration file. You can see here on the left-hand side, that is the case. Taking a look at the migration file, an empty migration file, there is some information inside of it. So we do have the operations ready to then create customizations potentially within our file. So that is empty, of course. There will be no operations performed if we were to actually migrate this now to the database. And we do have dependencies. Now, in a Django migration file, the dependency list specifies other migrations that must be applied before the current migration can be executed successfully. Maybe that's self-explanatory. If you imagine we have multiple migrations, it is very much like a chain reaction. Each migration depends on the previous one in the chain to have already built the necessary foundation. We will take a closer look at dependencies later on in this module. Maybe I'm thinking a little bit too deeply here, but let's not think about dependencies as, like I previously mentioned, like a chain reaction, but more appropriately, think of it as a correct execution order of migrations. Okay, so back to the main event. Let's talk about why we would even want to create an empty migration. Now, first up on this list is because there is a manual database change. So let's imagine that you modified the database directly with custom SQL. An empty migration serves as a dedicated space to document that change and version control those changes you've made. So typically you would create the custom SQL modifications, maybe create a new empty migrations, and then go ahead and add the custom SQL modifications to the migration file. If you're, of course, working in a team environment, using this empty migrations for custom SQL modifications provides a standardized approach to document and share those database changes. Of course, that might not be an important aspect within your project, but it does highlight the importance of the migration system or the relevance of the migration system in Django, providing a structured approach to managing the evolution of your database schema over time, while the models define the structure of the data. I have mentioned custom SQL queries a few times. So when making manual changes to the database using these custom SQL queries, it doesn't necessarily require a corresponding change to your data model structure. Hence the reason why we're utilizing an empty migration file to document these changes. So the Django migrations are primarily designed to manage changes to the database schema that originate from the changes in the Django models. But as we have been alluded to here, there are cases where you might need to perform database modifications outside the scope of the Django ORM. So here we create an empty migration file. We might be adding custom indexes or constraints, modifying table structures potentially, executing raw SQL queries for data manipulation, or calling stored procedures or triggers. So in such situations, you would typically create an empty migration to serve as a placeholder for this custom SQL modification. So ultimately, this allows us to document and version control the changes within your Django project, even though they are not directly tied to model changes. So let's summarize at this point and say that we might potentially create an empty migration when you need to record changes to the database schema that are not captured automatically by Django migration system. This could include adding migrations to populate initial data, did discuss that, altering the database schema manually, or performing other custom database operations. So that feeds us in nicely to the idea of using an empty migration for defining data migrations. Separating data migrations from model migrations in Django can be beneficial for several reasons: clarity and organization. So by keeping data migrations separate from model migrations improves the clarity and organization of your migration files. It's going to allow you to distinguish between changes to the database schema and changes to the data within our database. When or if you do need to revert or roll back, of course, you can do that separately. Now, in some cases, data migrations or potentially data transformations can involve quite heavy processing, which could impact the performance of the migration process. So by separating data migrations can allow you to optimize and fine-tune these tasks independently of model migrations, and that can ensure efficient and reliable migration execution. So overall, separating data migrations from model migrations in Django provides flexibility, clarity, and control over the migration process, enabling you to manage your database schema and data transformations effectively throughout the evolution of your application. Okay, so let's summarize here and say that creating an empty migration in Django offers a structured method to document and version control custom database modifications separate from model changes. This practice maintains clarity, organization within the migration history, enhances collaboration among team members, facilitates reverting changes when needed, and ensures consistent management of database schema evolution over time. Hopefully that's given you a starting point to consider utilizing empty migrations. We will be working through some exercises which will highlight some of the points or benefits or reasons to use empty migrations later on in this module.